Welcome to the Veganuary podcast, the podcast that helps you to try a vegan diet. It's stuffed full of hints and tips for vegans and veg-curious people. And welcome especially to my new co-host, Wendy.
Hi, Veganuary podcast listeners. It's great to be here.
We've gone transatlantic. Where are you, Wendy?
I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is about 2 hours from Washington, D.C.
And I am still in Leeds, West Yorkshire, UK. So if you listen to, I'm thinking of this as like series 2 of our podcast, okay, because we've had a bit of a break. So if you listen to the previous episodes and you're missing Kim has gone off to have a second baby. So she's taking a bit of a break. So Wendy is the co-pilot for the foreseeable future.
And Kim's are big shoes to fill, but I'm excited to join you, Stu, and hopefully share a little bit more about the vegan experience from a U.S. perspective.
Yes. And we have in this episode coming up a real exciting interview for our first episode. We have Chris Packham, which will be a really great interview. But before we get into that, Wendy, what is the most vegan thing that's happened to you this week?
Well, Stu, I went to the Taco Bell drive-thru the moment the new vegan nacho cheese sauce was released in the U.S.
Nice.
I don't really eat a lot of fast food, and I didn't really before I was vegan either, but you better believe as soon as one of the big chains offers a plant-based option, I will be first in the drive-thru line.
How was it?
It was really good. Kind of hit all the notes. A little greasy, a little salty. It was perfect.
Cool. Well, I decided to bend the rules a bit and go for my most vegan thing that's happened since the last episode of the podcast. Wendy, I don't know if you've noticed, but I got my nose pierced, which feels like a cliche vegan thing to do to me. Like, I feel like I went vegan a few years ago. Now I've got my nose pierced. It's only so long till I start wearing hemp and join a commune. So that's fine. How about any least vegan things? Have you got a least vegan thing?
Oh, I do have a least vegan. I went to a very fancy charity dinner last night with loads of free hors d'oeuvres, and the only vegan thing anyone had were pickles. So I ate a bowl of pickles for dinner.
Oh, I love pickles actually, but just only that for dinner.
Yeah, luckily I had some vegan leftovers waiting at home, so I was not starving. But yeah, I definitely ate my weight in pickles last night.
Good. Any ill effects today?
Time will tell.
Okay, cool. So we've got coming up on this episode, we've got Chris Packham, and Chris Packham, he's really well known in the UK as being someone who is really knowledgeable about animals, a great advocate for animal rights and animal welfare, and also someone who draws attention a lot to environmental issues and how we protect nature. And I kind of thought these are two big reasons that people sign up for Veganuary and go vegan, thinking about caring about animals and also thinking about the environment and being worried about what's happening to the planet. So I thought that was a really good kind of big topic for us to just have a chat through before we introduce Chris. I know it's a few years since you went vegan, but can you think back and remember the reasons why you decided to go vegan?
Oh, I certainly can. Yeah, it's been about 13 years for me. And I grew up in a pretty typical American household. So meat and potatoes on the table. I used to go hunting with my dad on the weekends even. And when I was in college, I was an environmental studies major. And I read Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma. And it was really the first time I'd even thought about where food came from. It was definitely the first time I'd heard the term factory farming. And I was mortified. And so I decided, I was going to be one of those people who looked my food in the face. And I wanted to know where it came from and only support local farms and organic free-range farms. And I started volunteering on a pig and chicken farm. And I will spare our listeners the details, but I just saw some things there that, I couldn't stomach. And it wasn't even the death. I knew the death was coming. I knew that was part of the story. But what I didn't know were all of the little injustices and mutilations that happened along the way. And I just saw some things I couldn't unsee and decided the only way to really align my play it with my values was to go vegan. So I actually did a 30-day challenge at the time. It was before Veganuary existed, but I
Traitor.
challenged myself. Well, that's why I believe so much in the Veganuary model. You know, a little challenge, and here I am more than a decade later.
How? What's the relationship with the hunter dad like these days? Do your family like embrace it, or are they?
Yeah, they do now. We had a couple rough years in the beginning when I was a fiery young
Yeah,
activist, sitting at my own table at Thanksgiving and things like that. But we've found some peace. We've landed in the middle, and my dad actually loves trying to make vegan food for me now.
that's so
So
nice. Yeah.
yeah, he's even smoked tofu in his meat smoker for me before, which
Oh,
was
delicious.
yeah,
I love smoked
lovely.
tofu. Um, yeah, my family's the same actually. Like, they're not vegan, but they enjoy the opportunity. My mum especially to cook vegan food. Um, for me, so I went vegan about 6 or 7 years ago. And I think like a lot of people in recent years had grown increasingly concerned about what was happening to the planet, and um, that was really my main driver. Really, was thinking about the environment and ways that I could lessen my impact on the environment, and thinking about how animals are treated came a lot later for me. Really, probably when I started working at Veganuary and I started to learn a lot more about what happens to animals on farms. But I think back then I also started to get a lot more interested in healthy eating, and particularly like the provenance of my food, where my food comes from, and how good it is for me, and all those things. So I think even though I wasn't necessarily thinking about what happens to animals, I was maybe thinking about the kind of factory system of how we get our
Yeah.
food, and there was something that made me a bit queasy about that. And then another aspect that was important for me is a kind of political thing. Like, so back then here in the UK, we just voted for Brexit, and like over there in the States, Trump was elected, and it just felt to me like my voice as a kind of voter didn't have much power. And I think I was maybe looking for other ways that I could kind of influence the world and policy and all those kinds of things. And eating vegan was one way to do that, it felt to me. You
Yeah.
kind of vote for the world you want every time you tap your credit card on the payment
Yeah.
device, right?
Oh, that's so well put.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, I think it's important for our listeners to know that you and I weren't born with bleeding hearts, right? I'm not a vegan from the womb. I know there are people like that out there, and I, admire and appreciate them so much. But I think I really had to look under the rug and try to find every justification that it was okay to eat meat before I
Yeah.
had to decide for myself that it wasn't. So, everyone makes these changes at their own pace.
So true. Right. Should we get on and introduce Chris Packham?
Let's do
We're
it.
thrilled to have Chris Packham as a guest on our podcast. I don't know whether Chris has crossed over to the States at all, or you mainly know him through Veganuary, Wendy. But I remember when I was a kid, Chris used to present a children's TV show called The Really Wild Show. And this was a children's TV show about animals and learning about animals. And it was a huge hit with kids, I guess, like pre-teens. And Chris really stood out because he had this like bleach blonde, like punky haircut, and this really cool dress sense, and he was like a bit edgy. And then I think he's gone on in the UK to become a bit of a national treasure. So we have a series on UK TV called Spring Watch and Autumn Watch, where they look at the UK's nature and how it changes in those seasons. And he's the main presenter on that. And I guess in the last few years, he's become a lot more vocal on animal rights and animal welfare and issues about nature and the environment, which is great to see. And he took part in Veganuary in 2019, and he became a Veganuary ambassador in 2020, and he's been a huge supporter of our work. So let's have a listen to our interview. So we have Chris Packham here. Chris, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the Veganuary podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
I'd love to start by asking you what your dream vegan meal is.
Well, I'm going to have to answer and say it's a meal at home cooked by my partner, Charlotte, because since becoming full-time proper vegan, rather than nudging along very close to it, which I was for some time, she launched in to changing her culinary abilities from, how can I phrase it on a scale of 1 to 10, 0 to 9.9.
Wow.
So her mother was a fantastic cook. Charlotte was not. But then a combination of a need to cook vegan food, a desire to cook more fresh food, the lockdown, when she focused upon cooking, basically, has meant that she's turned into a very proficient vegan cook. Nice. And it's now a rarity for me to eat a vegan meal out, which doesn't match Charlotte's standard.
Amazing. Are you? Yeah. So did you leapt into veganism together?
No. Charlotte remains, I would say, probably 90% vegan. She does still have some vegetarian traits.
Okay.
But obviously, if I'm at home, and sometimes my stepdaughter Megan is here, lifetime vegetarian, then we eat vegan. So the vast majority of the time, we're eating vegan food.
Right. Yeah. Nice.
Wow. Fantastic. Chris, where did your love of animals and nature begin?
Well, my parents tell me that when I was crawling around our very small suburban garden in Southampton, south of England, that would be in about 1962, 63, I was picking up beetles and tadpoles and ladybirds, ladybugs, as you call them in the US. And I was fascinated by anything that was living, slugs and snails. And they were very, commonplace organisms that I was meeting. And I mean, my parents say that I was basically into it before I could speak. On my first birthday, my grandmother bought me some bird books, and I know that because it's inscribed in the front of them. And I remember all of the images in those bird books. So I was clearly drawn to an interest in the natural world very early on. My parents didn't, facilitate that interest. My father was an engineer. My mother was a legal secretary, but they certainly encouraged my interest. So that was very fortunate. And it grew from those things which were initially in the garden to the things that were over the fence. And they were foxes and badgers and owls and hawks and so on and so forth. For me, it was always about learning more about them. I was always fascinated and curious. So I would keep quite a lot of those animals as a child. I'd had tanks and cages and jars, and I would put them in. And then when I got to about 12 or 13, my father bought me a pair of binoculars, and I realized that I could actually learn more about them if they were in their natural environment rather than having been moved into mine. And by then I was full on into, biological sciences. So it was about trying to uncover aspects of their physiology, anatomy, behavior, ecology. And that was really fueling my interest when it came to education.
And so that love of animals and that interest in nature, is that what inspired you to try going plant-based? I'm intrigued to know about your plant-based journey, really. Where did it start?
Okay, so I grew up with, my parents were kids during the war, so they went through rationing after the war. They had, essentially, with the benefit of hindsight and no recriminations, they had a very fixed idea about a balanced diet, what a balanced diet was. And that certainly included meat. So I would imagine, going back to my childhood in the 1960s, early 70s here, we would have been eating meat probably 5 days a week. And it was a whole spectrum of meat and fish, including fish in that as well, of course. But to be honest, as a kid, I didn't like meat. I didn't like fatty things. And as an autistic person, I had very specific reasons why I didn't like things, and that would come down to smell, texture, color, all of those sorts of things. So my parents struggled not just with meat, but with other components in my diet where I just basically refused to eat it, or there'd be a hell of a fight, but it wasn't. And then obviously, so I left home at 16 and I immediately stopped eating most meat. And to be honest with you, and I'm sure it's a familiar story from people of my age, I carried on eating chicken infrequently. I'd eat it when we were out, probably wouldn't buy it much if I was at home. I don't ever remember cooking chicken myself once I'd left home. I got to 22 and there was a promotion, a bit like Veganuary. It was a veggie week that someone had organised. And I thought, well, obviously I'll do that. And that was it. That was it. It was over. I did it in a week. And then the veganism didn't come until much later. And I was like what I would call pre-vegan. So there was no dairy products in the house. Obviously, the meat had all gone many years before. And no dairy products in the house, no cheese, no milk, none of that sort of thing. But if I was out, I might pop into like a coffee shop and I might have a muffin as a treat. And that, of course, would have had milk or butter in it. So that was my, and that went on for a few years. And then I went to an all-indoor dairy unit, and we were filming something about bovine tuberculosis, a disease that affects cattle in many parts of the world, here in the UK. And there's a perceived conflict between badgers and the cattle, and the cull of the badgers was in place. So we went to make a film about this. I didn't know anything about the farm before I turned up, and it just so happened that the vet that was working on the bovine tuberculosis was working with the cattle in this all-indoor dairy unit. Spent the day filming, drove out the gate, couldn't stop quick enough, found a lay-by, rang my partner and said, it's over. Wow. There's no more dairy. There's no more dairy. I mean, I can't, even now, thinking back to that day, it's a long time ago, it was profoundly shocking, the conditions that these animals were kept in. I mean, they weren't dirty, don't get me wrong. This wasn't a ghastly, poorly lit place where animals were being beaten with sticks. It was just the total unnatural environment that these poor animals were in. And that was it, just finished. And never looked back.
I've never visited a farm, but I've seen pictures, and it's always shocking how mechanical everything looks, almost like a kind of conveyor belt. And that's really feels to be at odds with the idea that we have maybe as children of what farms are like, animals in fields, etc.
Well, when it comes to industrial farming, that's the lie that's still perpetuated. If we go into supermarkets here in the UK and you look at the labelling, there are pictures of these sort of idyllic farms that we might have seen in the fairy tale books of our youth, where everything is lush and green and the animals are smiling. And I know some farmers, and they're livestock farmers, and they're high welfare livestock. Their animals are maybe brought in at periods during the winter. They're out in the fields, they're really well looked after, low stocking, they're organic, so on and so forth. One of those farmers was a dairy farmer. His cattle would do sort of 13, 14 lactation cycles, whereas those in that indoor unit are doing like 2, maybe 3. Because productivity drops off. So he would argue to me that those animals are very much more high welfare standard and have a far better life. And that's undoubtedly the case for those that are in those indoor units. The problem is that his produce just goes into a system where it's immediately lost amongst all of that industrially produced meat. Yeah. And food labelling is so bad here in the UK that even if you were to think, well, one way of moving progressively away from meat would be to eat meat of a higher welfare standard where there's input into biodiversity on that farm. How do you find it? Yeah. It's just not there unless you go to a farm shop, and they are few and far between, really, in the grand scheme of things. So industrial farming and the way that they control the market and marketing of their produce is a bad thing.
Yeah.
So you had this really profound light bulb moment and decided to cut dairy and to move towards plant-based. Was there anything that you found especially challenging in trying to adopt a plant-based diet?
No. I mean, people talk about cheese cravings and all of that sort of thing. I mean, the first thing that I did, and I had done previously, was obviously try vegan cheeses. But remember, we're going back a few years now, so they were in their infancy, and I would say that they at that point they weren't really cheeses; they were an alternative food, right? They didn't. Their capacity to sort of copy cheese wasn't well developed, not like it is now, where you can buy vegan cheeses, which, to the best of my memory, have the texture, taste, color of conventional dairy cheeses. But to be quite honest with you, no. I mean, I once I'd made that decision, once I'd spent that day in that place, there was nothing that was going to change my mind. So unfortunately, I have one of those minds. If I say something doesn't exist anymore, and obviously that was dairy, then it just vanished overnight, just went. That was it.
Wow.
And to be honest with you, I mean, it's been absolutely fantastic. It's encouraged my partner to cook the most amazing food. We have a lot more fresh food, a lot of tasty food, a lot more experimental, mixing flavors, food from other parts of the world, integrating those into other recipes, being inventive. None of that would have happened. That wouldn't have been something that would have kick-started that. And health-wise, I mean, I can't tell you I feel any healthier, but I can certainly tell you I don't feel any less healthy. Yeah. And I've had various medical tests recently, and I'm 62. They tell me I've got the heart of a 45-year-old. So wow. It can't be doing me too much harm.
Yeah, amazing. I love that because that was my experience as well. That rather than feeling a closing down of options, it was almost like an opening up of options. As you say, discovering lots of new fresh vegetables, fruit, etc., that you hadn't tried before, experimenting with different world cuisines. It's really exciting, actually. I think when you make that switch,
it is exciting. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was a one-stop, to ethical eating, because I think you could still be a vegan. And I mean, there's a lot of packaging in some of the vegan food. There's a lot of carbon miles in that food. Yeah. There's a lot of additives, palm oil being one of the, principal things that we have concerns about, or identifiable things. But I think that if you have made a conscious decision to think, okay, I'm going to basically go vegan, that means that your mind is in a place where you're thinking about food health, and you're thinking about food welfare and its environmental costs. So it's more likely to lead you to explore how to cut down on that excessive plastic packaging, how to try and avoid palm oil and other unhelpful additives. So I think that it's not an answer within itself, but it's certainly a launch pad where you start asking questions about how you eat as ethically as you possibly can.
Absolutely. And you've touched on a few environmental issues there, and we really wanted to take the opportunity while you're here to ask you lots about the environment. I think when we think about what's happening to our environment and animals, often we think about the rainforest, the rhinos, the elephants, and the polar bears. I don't want to minimize any of those because I think they're really important, but they sometimes feel quite distant. And I know that there's lots to be concerned about here in the UK as well. And I just wondered if you had any examples you can give us of things that people might be able to see with their own eyes, or things that might surprise people that are happening, here where we live, if you can take my meaning.
Well, I mean, I think we've got to firstly, I mean, one of the things I always struggled with is when I looked at a pig and looked at a dog, I couldn't understand why one of them is a loved companion animal and the other one is food. And basically, I think it goes down to our formative education, because we have farm animals. Yeah. And I struggle with that, you see, because as a definition, because I think that's where things start to go wrong in education, where we teach young people that this is not an animal. It's a farm animal, and therefore it's essentially food. And that disconnect begins to grow from that young age, where, people will therefore, form relationships with animals, but they won't form relationships with things that they essentially think are food, because obviously they're going to eat it. And that would be challenging to have those sorts of complete relationships with something which ultimately you're going to eat. Then you've got the disconnect from the vast majority of people now from the farmed environment, because a lot of people I imagine still think it's all about green fields and barns and smiling cows and pigs and sheep, because they don't get to see those vast sheds full of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of chickens. They don't get to see those, dark pigs in their crush crates and so forth. So there's a very clear disconnect there. But going back to your environmental point, and that is that a couple of things that I can cite on that account, and that is that since 1970, we've lost 69% of the world's wildlife. 69% since 1970. That's in my lifetime. Yeah. And a significant contributor to that is loss of habitat, that rainforest that you mentioned. And that's because it's been cut down for agriculture or animal agriculture. And a classic case might be the Amazon, which we know is an area which is becoming terribly deforested, lungs of the world, enormous biodiversity, incredibly important to our planet. But we see the Amazon being deforested, and they grow an enormous amount of soy. And the soy is exported. 80% of it goes to China to feed pigs, some parts of Brazil. Soy is taken from Brazil, it's taken across the Atlantic. It's landed in Liverpool. It's put into trucks. It's taken down to the Wye Valley, which is in the southwest, central west of the UK. It's fed to chickens in these vast sheds, these Franken chickens, which grow to maturity in 5 weeks. The feces are taken outside and they're dumped onto the fields legally. It rains, that washes all of the nutrients from those feces into the rivers. And the River Wye is 2 years away, it's said, from being ecologically dead. So here we have a joined up world. We've got deforestation, jaguars, macaws, all sorts of animals losing their home, the biodiversity that we need to protect our planet. Then we've got industrial agriculture, and then we've got that being shipped around the world. It's being fed to factory farm chickens, which are essentially pooing onto the fields, which is washing into the rivers, which is killing them, and that's diminishing the UK's biodiversity. And our recent State of Nature report shows that we are one of the most nature-depleted set of nations in the world. So there's a perfect example of how animal agriculture is having a very negative impact on our wildlife in our backyard when it all started in Brazil.
Yeah, and if you know that area around the River Wye, you really sense the tragedy, or you really understand the tragedy of it, because that's such a beautiful spot around, just north of Bristol there. And also we hear so much in the press about what's going on with human sewage being pumped into our waterways. I don't feel like we're hearing so much about what's happening with runoff from farms. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that's such an interesting case study.
And it's not isolated. A lot of slurry is flung onto farm fields because they don't practice, obviously, regenerative farming. It's just crop after crop after crop, nitrogen, herbicides, pesticides, slurry, and it just gets washed in. And eutrophication, the nutrient enrichment of our waterways, lakes, rivers, is significantly important here in the UK because of the vast amounts of agricultural runoff that we're getting here, and its poor management. So that is extremely dangerous. And you're right to draw the attention to the fact that human sewage to overburdened infrastructure, outdated infrastructure that the water companies fail to manage is one thing, but the farm runoff is very, very significant.
Yeah.
Now, you've touched quite a bit on deforestation and biodiversity loss and eutrophication. Are there any other concerning climate trends at the moment that you could summarize for us? And how are we seeing these play out day to day?
Well, quite clearly, we're seeing changes in weather patterns. So climate is affecting weather, and we're seeing extreme weather events. And here in the UK in the last year, we've had drought. We've had excessive flooding in numerous locations. This is flooding that's taken people's lives. It's ruined their homes and ruined their livelihoods. So whilst we're not suffering as many people in the global south are, we are beginning to suffer hardships in the UK on account of climate breakdown. There's no question of that. But aside from all of that water and all of that flooding, what we're seeing in significant parts of the world, and parts of the world where we're dependent on agriculture to produce the world's food, not just that country or that region's food, but food that we eat ourselves, is that they're beginning to dry out. And of course, if they dry out, then water it becomes increasingly in short supply. And what we know is that when it comes to using water effectively to produce food, it costs enormously more to produce meat than it does to produce plant-based food. Because basically you've got to grow the plant-based food, and then you've got to give it to those animals, and you've got to give them water as a like we obviously need water to drink, and they do too, as they mature to a point where they can be slaughtered, and that can be several years. So the amount of water required to produce a kilogram of beef versus a kilogram of vegetables is disproportionately higher. So the environmental cost of producing meat, as climate change and breakdown, precipitates more and more of these sorts of changes, is going to grow and grow. It's already too great. We know that we can't continue to eat the amount of meat that we do. There's no ambiguity about that. The science is quite clear. And also what's clear is the contribution to emissions. So it's not just that we're using all of this water. Producing that meat is adding significantly to the emissions, which are greenhouse gases and warming up the planet. And there is argument about how much that is. So in the UK, it's said to be somewhere between 16 and 20% of our emissions, bearing in mind that transport in the UK is 11%. So it's higher than all of us driving our, petrol and diesel cars and flying around the place. Yeah. On a global scale, the figures vary. And this is something where I do think we need to do some serious research and come up with some figures that we know have real veracity, because I've seen it, said that those figures could be as high as 65 and 70%. That's down to animal agriculture. If that were the case, at the moment we can't prove that, because of the ambiguity in the figures, then we ought to be focusing a lot more on animal agriculture than perhaps we are on fossil fuels. Not that we would stop on fossil fuels, but you get my point.
Yeah. Do you feel that people are fully understanding the consequences of what climate change is going to mean? Because you were just touching on some issues there about loss of land, how much water we need to use, and I was just thinking about sometimes these kind of environmental issues are put down as concerns for tree huggers and people who love animals and people who love nature, and that's seen as a kind of niche concern. Sometimes I don't feel like people are fully understanding what it's going to mean in terms of mass movement of people, increasing costs of food, potentially outbreaks of war, all those kinds of things. Do you feel like people are missing and are not joining the dots completely on issues like that?
I think that there are a couple of things. There was a sort of a very, a report written by Chatham House prior to the COP26. I read it on the train going home from Waterloo one day. It was one of the most startling and shocking reports. It wasn't about the weather, the climate impacts, the biodiversity loss. It was about societal collapse and what is likely to happen as these things roll out. It's frankly just terrifying. You're right. It doesn't appear in the news. I think the media, if you like, are concerned that people have become frightened of fear. And as a consequence of that, they don't like scaring people. Yeah. And very often, I think a little bit of fear is very useful to us in its fundamental terms. Fear instigates fight or flight. Well, given that there's no other planet to fly to, that means we ought to be fighting for this one. So I think telling people the truth is something that we've been constantly asking the media for more of for some considerable time. And I don't think they've reached that point where they are telling people the truth. I think that it's okay to frighten people so long as you offer them a potential solution and you offer them things which are not seen as problems, but seen as opportunities. And many of those solutions can be recognized as opportunities, not problems. We're talking about one here. We're talking about moving from a plant, basically an omnivorous diet to a plant-based diet. I don't see that as a problem. I see that as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to live a healthier life, a more interesting life, because of what we said about the way that food can be produced. I feel better within myself because I've done something progressive when it comes to looking after the environment. And Obviously, I've made a significant contribution, as much as I can as an individual, to reducing poor standards of animal welfare, which we know exist and aren't addressed. So for me, that's an opportunity. It's not a problem. You know, that if the government says to me, we all need to eat less meat, I think, okay, that's not a problem. There's an opportunity to do something new here, something progressive and useful. So I think it's the way that we haven't yet got to enough people. And here in the UK, I've got to say, and I imagine in many parts of the United States as well, people have not yet been put in enough pain. Because when the interesting thing about our species is that we are very good at cure, but we're not very good at prevention. And whenever we get hit by something which is catastrophically stressful for our species, we overcome it. COVID is a case in point. You know, we knew there was going to be a pandemic. Everyone was telling us that. There was no preparedness. Tragically, millions of people died. But within 8 months, you've got a vaccine which cures millions more people and prevents their death. But at this point in time, I just think, you know, there's nothing as tangible as our friends and families being rushed to hospital with a potentially life-threatening disease and witnessing that every night on TV. So until climate breakdown comes home and starts to bite people in their own bottoms, as it has in Scotland recently, people killed, houses washed away, businesses ruined, so on and so forth. But if we were to ask those people tonight, then they would answer the question very differently than the vast majority of people who think it's something that's happening over there and it's not yet happening here. And I think that as soon as they realise that it's happening to them, then we will take more significant action.
So interesting. And that comparison between how we reacted to COVID and how we're reacting to climate change is something that you brought up in your documentary, which is It Time to Break the Law, which I really, really enjoyed. It's such an interesting watch. And you cram so much into such a short space of time in that documentary. Could you summarise what kind of conclusions you came to about how people can take action to try and, you know, take action for the planet?
Well, I think that one of the most important things we all need to realise is that we can empower ourselves as individuals to make a difference. You know, a lot of people see these issues as beyond their scope of influence. And they say, well, you know, I can't do anything. I'm just a drop in the ocean. But what I would say is, but what's an ocean but a multitude of drops? You know, so if you do something and your empowerment makes you feel good, which it typically does, because if we do something positive, it makes us feel good. And then we, you know, inherently a human trait is that we like to tell other people about what we've done good. And they think, oh, I might have some of that. And then it begins to grow. And then it's not you as a single drop in an ocean. It's a community of drops. And that begins to grow and grow and grow until it can have influence over that ocean. Now, the only problem that we face, I think, is that it's taking quite a long time for that to spread and grow and that influence to grow. And we are up against, you know, vested interests who want business to stay the same, bad business as usual. And what we've seen, obviously, in the plant-based movement is that it was growing very, very rapidly. And we've now hit a little bit of a plateau. Why have we hit that plateau? Well, because the meat industry and their lobbyists have essentially woken up. And they're throwing huge sums of money and lobbying power at governments, essentially, decision makers. And certainly here in the UK, we went through a process whereby government advice was to eat less meat. But now government policy, when it's published, that's been entirely written out of it. And I looked at a policy document the other day, and what it said, rather than eat less meat, was significant modifications to our daily diet, which is ambiguous. It could be anything. So that powerful lobby have recognised that due to the very rapid expansion of interest in some parts of the world in a plant-based diet, that they needed to act, and they've acted quite forcefully, unfortunately. So I think that we've got to accept that. So this brings us to a second point. In order to keep that progress happening, in order to in fact make it happen quicker, to accelerate it, then we need to take action, and that's where the protest comes in. We essentially, I believe, that we have laws to make sure that we have obviously a stable society. But those laws mean that we have to give up some of our freedoms. We can't drive down the motorway at 100 miles an hour. We've got to drive at 70 miles an hour. Some people might want to drive at 100, and they may see that as taking away of their freedom to drive at 100 miles an hour. You've got to drive at 70, which is a really simple example. But what we get in return for subjugating to those laws is that we get access to fundamental resources that we need. That's what stable society gives us, fundamental resources. It should give us access to food. It should give us shelter, homes. It should give us education. It should give us health. It should give us all of those sorts of things. The problem is that at the moment, under the pressures of climate breakdown, at some point in the foreseeable future here and already in other parts of the world, that there isn't that stability of society, and those resources are not available to people. So are the laws still fit for purpose? And what I think people are beginning to do is to question what's more important. Is it the law or is it the ethics of the situation? Because if the law is no longer fit for purpose and it isn't protecting us and providing us with those resources that we need, then surely ethics become more important than the law. And that's why people are prepared to break those laws, because they're not serving them any longer.
Yeah. Interesting.
Oh, Chris, you've been really outspoken on all of these issues, which of course are controversial. And you've been the victim of threats and abuse, not just online, but at your home too. How do you deal with that?
I reconcile that it's part of a process, because I and others like me are asking for people to change their minds more rapidly than they can or want to. The human species is a remarkable organism, very intelligent, adaptable, inventive, imaginative, creative, so on and so forth. We can and do and great things. But when it comes to changing our minds and therefore our practices, we're not very good at that. We're very resistant to that. Even when you offer people a better alternative, even when you do offer them not a problem but an opportunity, they would rather carry on doing what they're doing. And that's an anathema to me, but it isn't to some people. So if I'm asking them to change their minds more rapidly, then a fraction of those people will be angered, intimidated, and they will lash out. And that's what we see, whether it's online hate, online bullying, trolling, or whether it's, damage to property and so on and so forth. What's more worrying than those individuals who are confronted with that problem that they can't overcome is that when it's orchestrated, where it's orchestrated by those with a vested interest in keeping bad business as usual when they know it's bad business. So, for instance, those would be lobbyists from the meat industry. If they are working collectively and perhaps cleverly to undermine the integrity of people like ourselves who are trying to, offer people a chance to see a new way of doing things, which is less harmful and therefore critical to embrace at this time in our history, then that is more worrying. I'm less worried about people saying unpleasant things, sending me death threats, and setting fire to parts of my property, than I am knowing that somewhere out there are people sat in a room from the meat industry, the fossil fuel industries, thinking, right, how can we damage this guy's reputation? How can we undermine this organization's credibility? And how can we destabilize that organization so they're less effective when it comes to campaigning? And that's what's happening. So we've got to be clear that is what's happening, because we've seen that plateauing in plant-based due to the rise of interest and expenditure. I mean, it's all there, the expenditure by the meat lobby.
Well, thank you for being such an outspoken voice. You're such a respected person in British life. It's so amazing to have someone that's willing to speak out on these issues and represent Veganuary as well. We really appreciate that.
I think Veganuary, doesn't Veganuary encapsulate so many of the things we're talking about?
Yeah.
We're not saying to people, you must. We're saying, here's an opportunity. We have lots of months off, don't we? We have Movember. We have periods of time where we say to people, why don't you think about doing things differently? Yeah. And sometimes that's for charitable reasons, but very often it's for lifestyle reasons. And Veganuary, in its very rapid rise, I think, that success comes down to the fact that, all we ever said with it was, how about thinking about this? How about trying this? And when we saw retailers, when we saw chefs and restaurants and people buying into it, I mean, you'll remember, the Greggs vegan sausage roll, and And what a thing that was. It was, everyone was talking about it because Greggs had seen an opportunity to jump before they were pushed, a small family-owned company, and they did that. And all of a sudden, you've got people like me and Piers Morgan having an argument on the news in the morning, and then the whole lot sell out, and that was because people just wanted to try them.
Yeah.
And they did try them, and therefore Veganuary scored points.
Yeah. And they've been a huge hit. I've got a funny story about Greg's vegan sausage roll.
Yeah, go on. I want to hear it.
My partner, Imogen, was pregnant with our son, and she was nearly 2 weeks overdue, so she was about to be induced, and we were doing everything we could think of to try and get the baby to come. And then she ate a Greg's vegan sausage roll, and then it just happened. So I've got the Greg's vegan sausage roll to thank.
I don't think we can vouch for the scientific veracity of that, but yeah, good story.
And the other thing we touched on, you talked about an ocean. You feel like you're one person and you can't make any impact, but you're just a drop in the ocean. But an ocean is made of many drops, and I think that's a really key message that we like to send from Veganuary. Is the kind of collective effort of lots of people doing it at the same time is so powerful. I'd love to sort of finish by asking you. We've talked a lot about lots of fairly worrying things that are happening in the planet. I'd love to know what gives you hope.
Well, several things give me hope. Firstly, you're right. We've dwelt on a lot of problems, but we do have the solutions to the vast majority of those problems. So we've got a complete toolkit of technologies, abilities, things that we've tried and tested and practiced, energies, which we could roll out to solve the vast majority of those problems. We have alternatives, and they're there. That the problem that we've got is they're not being rolled out rapidly enough and broadly enough to make a significant difference. So the situation, I think, would be hopeless if we didn't have solutions to those problems, and we do have significant solutions to them. And veganism, plant-based, is part of that portfolio of solutions. The second thing is that I'm inspired by the voices and actions of young people. And I think that young people may not have the punk ethos of the old Chris, but what they do have is very clear vision, and they have very clear concerns about their future. But when they speak about those, they do so with great clarity, and they do so without any risk aversity. Basically, what I'm saying to you is that they will stand up and tell the truth to power. And I think that for that reason, one of the things that we need to do to expedite solving those problems and implementing those solutions is that we have to trust those younger people. At the moment, some people would argue that we listen to them. I would say that's a bit patronizing. What we actually need to do is trust them. They have to become part of the decision-making process. It's their future. And to be fair, my generation, you guys are younger than me, so I'm not going to pick on you, but my generation clearly hasn't done enough to make sure that they have a solid platform to move forward into a healthy, happy, sustainable planet. So we can do everything we can now to do that, but we need their energy, we need their vision, we need that lack of risk aversity, and we need their clarity. So young people, I find, within the climate, biodiversity loss movement, activism of all kinds, actually, I find to be extraordinarily refreshing. And I think that, as I said, empowering them is something that we should think about doing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Well, you would say that. You're a young person.
We're somewhere in between, aren't we? Are we millennials, Wendy? I'm a millennial, I think.
I think we're millennials, elder millennials, maybe.
But I mean, listen, if you're under 30, you're young. And I think the reason I would say that was that age in terms of influence has changed because, look, people in the UK are struggling to buy their own houses, at the age that we were able to do so only like 40 years ago. So I think that basically when it comes to that sort of empowerment, I would consider myself a young person now up to the age of 30. There's no question of that. I don't think it's about being a child or a teenager any longer. And certainly that generation that have perhaps gone through full-time education, or they've gone out and they're experienced in the workplace, they have begun to acquire a perception of the world which is very different than that I had when, and could see when I was growing up. So it's only right and proper that they play a role in the shaping of that world. So if you're under 30, you're young. That's what I'm saying. And it's time that you were empowered to make those differences. You should be given decision-making choices and involved in all of those decision-making choices.
So, Chris, we have one question that we've been asking all of our guests on the podcast this season, because the theme of Veganuary this year is vote for veggies. So we're really focused on celebrating the vegetable and reminding people of all the great benefits of eating veggies. So it sounds like Charlotte does most of the cooking, but do you have a favorite vegetable to cook or eat?
Yeah, I do, and it's one that we've only met recently in the UK. It might be different in the US, but it's celeriac. Now, when I was a kid, it was very much about vegetables were far more seasonal. So basically, we had turnips and we had swedes and we had parsnips and then we had beetroot. I do like beetroot. I like beetroot very much. I drink beetroot juice every day. But one thing that I didn't start eating until about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit before, was celeriac. And at that point, I was spending some time living in France, and it was there that we discovered it, and we didn't even know what it was. But I like the flavor. I like the texture of it. Baked celeriac. I mean, it's almost like a steak, isn't it? And you can season it, and it's, So yeah, I'm going to say celeriac. It's probably a bit off the wall, but it's one of those things that's come to me later in life, and I've taken a real fondness to. I'm a bit of a faddist when it comes to vegetables, though. Apart from beetroot, which I've loved all of my life, even as a child, I loved beetroot. But I go through sort of vegetable fads. So I had a bit of a parsnip fad a few years ago, but I'm massively into the celeriac now.
I love it. It's niche, and I really like that. And I never have celeriac, so you've maybe inspired me to go out and have some. Yeah, great.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, you can add it to. I mean, it is a versatile vegetable, like most of those root vegetables. So you can do quite good things to it. You're right, Charlotte does most of the cooking. But what I can do is cut it into relatively thick slices, season it, and then fry it in a pan, and you get like a celeriac sort of steak in the shape and texture. You've got to bite through it. It's not soft vegetable, So try that.
Brill. Right, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thanks so much for your time today.
You're most welcome, and I hope Veganuary goes well. I should be supporting it and trying to spread the word as much as I can, as I do every single year. And we really need to push back about these against these insidious meat lobbyists at the moment, and make sure that the plant-based movement continues apace.
Brill.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Wendy, wasn't it lovely to speak to Chris Packham?
Yeah, what a fantastic interview.
Absolutely. We're going to go on to what I'm thinking of as our highbrow cultural exchange now. So you have suggested something which is like a US classic dish for me to eat, make, find and eat. And I have suggested something for you, which is a classic UK dish. So what have I got? I have candied yams, which you sent me a recipe for here. And I mean, we eat sweet potato here a lot in the UK, but we never eat it like this. This has got a lot of sugar on and it's topped with marshmallows. Is this something you eat every day?
No, this is very much a holiday dish.
Okay. This is like
super popular for Thanksgiving in the US.
Okay, here we go. And it was really easy to make once I found vegan marshmallows.
Your face.
Interesting. It's very savory for something that's very sweet. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I do. Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, fully transparent, not one of my favorite things. I love sweet potatoes. I find the addition of marshmallows to be a bit garish. But yeah, that is a classic holiday food.
Well, thank you for that. It was very easy to veganize once I found vegan marshmallows, which were very easy to find. What have you got?
Well, Stu, I have a bit of a travesty for you today because I tried to make Yorkshire pudding. And we joked a little bit as you sent me this recipe about this being a difficult thing to make. And I made some jokes, but to be honest, I was still feeling pretty cocky about it because I cook a lot. I thought, this isn't going to be so bad. I'm going to nail it. That is not what happened. So let me show. I know not everyone can see.
That looks not too bad.
The shape, it has the nice little well in the middle. Now, I did cheat a little bit and press it down with a spoon because I didn't get the natural well. But the texture, I mean, they're really squishy. Is this right?
But you've let them, I guess they've cooled down. You're not eating them hot, so that might be why.
But so the recipe I used, it had a tablespoon of oil going into each muffin cup.
Right.
And I think that is too much because these are very greasy. It's almost just like a sponge filled with vegetable oil.
I mean, it sort of sounds like what we would eat here. So if it makes
Maybe
you feel
with a little gravy, it would be better.
with gravy on. Sometimes in pubs and things, they sell really big ones and they put the whole roast dinner inside and then they top it all up with gravy. That's pretty good. If it makes you feel any better, even the non-vegan Yorkshire puddings are notoriously difficult to make. So I think you've done a really good job.
Well, thank you very much.
But I'm sensing you may not be going back for seconds.
I'm intrigued. I want to try it again. I don't think this is my recipe.
Okay, fair enough. Before we go, so the theme of this year's Veganuary is vote for veggies. We're celebrating vegetables. So I thought you and I could start a little vegetable league and choose some of our favourite vegetables. So I have in here, in my shopping bag, some vegetables. And I have an oven. I didn't want anyone to think that by feeling the vegetables, I was in any way rigging the competition. So I've got an oven glove. And so I'm going to pull out 2 vegetables and we can decide which is better. Okay? So here we go. Here's vegetable number 1. Drum roll. I've got a fennel.
Oh, it's a fennel.
Where does your mind first go to when you think of fennel?
I love fennel. I think it is a massively underappreciated vegetable. And I learned recently that it's really good for digestion. So it's a nice one to slice really thin, put in a salad. I've had fennel teas that I like, so I think it's a good pick.
It's a bit divisive. The aniseedy sort of taste can be, some people really like that, some people hate it. I like it. I recommend slicing it in half and doing it on the barbecue, like sort of char grilled. That's a good way to cook it. Okay, vegetable number 2. Oh. It's a broccoli.
All right, classic.
What we're saying. Something I like to do with broccoli is just stick it in the oven. And I know I've just criticised the sweet potato with loads of sugar on, but a little sprinkle of sugar on some broccoli and some chili flakes and then roast it in the oven with a bit of oil. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with you on the roasting. I think roasting's the only way to go. Like nice charred broccoli, the best.
So what which way are you leaning, fennel or broccoli?
I love an underdog. So my heart is to go with fennel. But I'll tell you, I've been researching vegetables a lot over the last few days for a little project we're doing for Veganuary USA. And broccoli has some brilliant stats, really low water footprint, really high nutrition profile. So I got to go for broccoli this time.
Interesting. I feel like, unlike fennel, broccoli is a sort of an everyday food, or, maybe twice a week food. So let's go for broccoli. It's going up on our imaginary leaderboard. Okay. So next week, we've got the amazing Deborah Meaden coming to talk to us. But all that's left for me to say now is that you've been listening to the Veganuary podcast, which was recorded at Distorted Podcast Studios and produced by Jim Moore at Bloody Vegans Productions. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and rate us 5 stars. And if you want to contact us, you can email us at podcast@veganuary.com. And you'll find Veganuary on all the normal social media channels.
And don't forget, you can take part in Veganuary by signing up at veganuary.com to receive 31 daily emails filled with hints, tips, and recipes, which introduce you to a vegan diet. It doesn't have to be January. You can sign up anytime.
Oh,
Thanks for listening.
Thank you. See you later.